Measure the drip.
It was a robotic voice. 325 centimeters. Victor recorded the results to the spreadsheet. It was already converting it to other measurements. 128 inches, 10.7 feet, 3.6 yards. Those numbers were being cross-referenced with earlier measurements. Patterns were being calculated, equations shifted. Victor knew they were only looking for the whole numbers. Something about the measurement system without the decimals was a key to the pattern. It changed rapidly, but they could keep up.
Measure the drip.
Victor kept up. 134 inches, no decimals. It was getting longer, changing measurements. He didn't know why, but then again, that was the reason they did this. None of them knew why. Victor wasn't the only one recording. All around him were similar computers manned by very dissimilar people. Some were older, some weren't even past high school. That was part of the requirement. Many different people had to record the same results. If there were any discrepancies, they would just take the average input. It seemed redundant, but they were studying an anomaly, something no one understood and therefore didn't know how to deal with. It made sense to control everything they could in preparation for what they couldn't.
Measure the drip.
Victor punched in the numbers. It was tedious work. He was kilometers away from the anomaly, but the video feed told him everything he needed to know. They meticulously marked all areas below the subject so people like him could measure the length of its drip. He wasn't sure what the drip was in the grand scheme of things, but to him it was just some brown, dangly protrusion. It grew sometimes, it shrank sometimes. It was simply the drip, and it was measured because maybe that proved something to someone way above his pay grade. Victor knew he should feel special. These days there was a whole lot of history to be made, and people like him were making it. He didn't feel special.
Measure the drip.
192 inches.
That's enough for today. Please return at 7 a.m. sharp. Attendance will be logged.
The voice's send-off was accompanied by scraping chairs and dragging feet.
Thank you for your service,
the voice added. It was all pre-recorded, but the last line felt human to him. Something about the tone shift halfway through made it more genuine. He supposed that was the point. Victor met Oslier's gaze on the way out. They'd synchronized their departure times for months, but only started talking recently. One single moment of eye contact was all it took, and now the two walked out together every day. Even so, they kept up the tradition that started it all. The eye contact was like an icebreaker. It was how the two let each other know, "Hey, I'm alright with socializing today. You?" As usual, she didn't speak until the both of them were almost out of the building. "So, numbers, huh?" She wasn't looking for a specific answer. She was just playing ambiguously, saying to speak. "Yeah, numbers," Victor agreed, doing the same. They walked in silence for a while. It was a cold, windless afternoon. Every other streetlight was out to save power. The sprawling complex was sucking up almost everything this town could provide. It practically was the new town. "I wonder why we do it." "What?" Her bluntness caught Victor off guard. "Why we record numbers? Why we measure the drip? Why we have an anomaly just floating in a little cell? Why we think this can give us answers? A whole bunch of whys, basically." Victor sighed sympathetically. "And don't forget the whats." "Victor," her face was stern. "Yeah?" 143 inches. Victor laughed and she joined in. It released a little knot of tension they didn't know they were holding. Victor mimed typing on a keyboard and submitting some irrelevant string of numbers. "But for real," she cleared her throat. "Every time I hear that phrase, I ask more and more. I wish I could have less questions for once." Maybe that's not really possible for us anymore. They passed several darkened street lamps, and Victor stopped to look at the sky. It hasn't been that simple in a long time. Without the glare of the town's lights, Victor could stare all the way into space. From what he knew, that hadn't always been the case. Light pollution used to work differently. Oslia's steps came to a halt next to him. He could tell she was looking at the same sky. I once heard that starlight takes thousands of years to reach our atmosphere. Do you think it still works that way? Victor didn't think she would like his answer. She started walking again. I hate not knowing. Yeah, he said. Me too. Human beings have had hundreds of thousands of years to adapt to natural laws. We evolved the stamina and cunning to compete with predators and prey, to eat and survive. Our bodies and minds were shaped by a constant, ceaseless pressure. That was part 1. We had 28 years to adapt to part 2. 1992 is when everything stopped. 1993 is when everything transformed. The years after were one continuous double take. Every law humans knew was refuted and broken. New beings found their way to Earth's little neck of space. Objects changed. People changed. Victor grew up in the small rural town of Kinchi. In 1993, that area was replaced with Nkokoi de Parese. Most people don't know what that means, and they aren't going to. It's something that one experiences, and the quarantine zone makes sure people do as little of that as possible. Somewhere along the line, people decided to stop giving ground. Somewhere much further, they developed the mechanisms to let them put that into practice. It started with a man named Albert Hawking. He devised countless theories to archive and predict the nature of anomalies. Most of them aren't used. Theories are just that. But men like Albert Hawking give rise to men like Peter Pigeonhole. Pigeonhole's work put Victor and Oslia where they are today. They enter complexes and punch in numbers because of his work. They receive real answers, supposedly, because of his work. The Pigeonhole postulate stated an anomaly could be studied by the measure of its drip. The research was in its infancy, but well-dressed reporters liked to talk about its future application. They would sit there with their gesticulations and their charts to wax on and on. Victor and Oslia had mixed feelings about the postulate. To Victor, it had never been anything other than a job. It hadn't saved his home, but it let him afford a new one. A sagging little house sandwiched between a barber shop and another, equally tired-looking home. Each night, Victor would go home and face the culmination of his attempts to seek shelter. The sight of his house brought a mixture of malaise and nostalgia, and he would enter before those feelings became unbearable. In his waking life, Victor could manipulate what he felt. When he slept, that was no longer the case. Victor was plagued with a reoccurring nightmare. In his dream, he stood stranded in a forest where the sky was swamp water and the plants were made of thick muscle. He would watch the trees in horror and fascination, tall, breathing monoliths of heavy animal meat. He would see them tense, waiting, expectant. Victor knew he could not move lest he accidentally touch these trees. The moment he did, they would sense his location and their feral flailings would break him. Victor understood that movement meant death, so he waited motionless until the dream ran its course and the gasping trees became creaking house. Oslia was also plagued by a reoccurring nightmare. In her dream, she wandered a cave lit by eerie blue lights and electricity that arced between them. Surrounding her were broken screens, smashed desktops, shattered CDs and frayed wires. There would be a figure, too, a sparking, crackling robot assembled from that uncanny valley between recognizable object and geometric gibberish that wailed her name and groped blindly through the cave. Oslia knew the robot would kill her if it could. She understood that staying still meant death, so she was always on the move until the dream ran its course. Victor did not tell Oslia about his dreams because he did not want to worry her. Oslia did not tell Victor about her dreams because she did not want to worry. This was the world they shared. "It didn't used to be about the thing that kills you," Oslia said one night. The two were sitting beside one of the only remaining supermarkets and enjoying the late summer breeze. There was a faint smell of produce and a sickly sweet undertone, like the moment just before food rotted. Said Victor, still eating the cookies he'd bought there moments prior. "What do you mean?" "Back then, you know, I've been thinking a lot about that. It wasn't about the thing that killed you. People acted like it was, but it wasn't." Victor nodded, not understanding, but trusting he would. She read his acknowledgement and continued. "I mean, like wars, cancers, pollutants, plagues. Those were the killers back in the day. And I'm sure they did their fair share of killing, don't get me wrong, but the population kept growing. It was up to 5 billion before. Did you know that?" Victor nodded, then realised what she'd been asking him and shook his head. "It was more than them killing us." She leaned back against the side of the store and hugged herself, as if the breeze were no longer comfortable. "It was about how they made us fear them, how they changed our habits, how we wasted whole lives being burdened by the weight of their potential. It would take one death to make 50 people cower, 100 people, 1,000 people." She looked at him, then looked away at something only she could see. "It was more than the death, it was the suffering." Victor thought of his dream. He envisioned the meaty trees superimposed on the landscape and the certainty of what they promised. Oslia was doing the same, seeing her robot beckoning in the distance. "And now?" Victor asked, already dreading the answer. "Now, it's about the thing that kills you." The anomaly they had in the complex was one of many, but by a statistical quirk it was the only one Victor and Oslia studied. No one had brought this particular oddity into captivity. One day it was not within the complex, and the next day it was already floating in a containment chamber. This drew scrutiny, of course. Such things don't go uninvestigated. In the end, the people at the top decided they couldn't deem it any more or less safe than the various other anomalies, procured by various means, fitted all throughout the building. In the world of phenomena, this entity's behaviour could not be correlated with any certainty of risk, and so it sat and was studied. The anomaly resembled a sea urchin. It had a bright red centre and cooling blue spines that jutted lethally outward in radial configuration. Sometimes these spines would appear softer, harder, or differently textured. Rarely, they would change to something harder to describe, like sadder, itchier, or confused. The anomaly never changed its shape. It communicated all these elements with the way it reflected light, the way it moved, and some other third process. It played coquettishly with the human senses beyond its 12-inch plate glass. Some of the higher-ups named it EC001. Others nicknamed it Brian. Victor didn't name it anything. To him, it wasn't even really an object. Sure, he'd seen it. In fact, he would see it several times a day in his monitor's upper left display. But his job wasn't about the thing. It was something the thing did. It was numbers. The thing itself had no more relevance to him than a dog in downtown Amsterdam.
Measure the drip.
It was a robotic voice. Victor measured the drip. It was a robotic action. He saw the anomaly and the drip as separate, and in a way this was true. You wouldn't see the drip by visually inspecting an anomaly. You saw the drip with countless overlaying instruments, signals and particle scanners. The drip was something you had to peel back layers to find. It was something more primal than DNA, some encoded message about where a thing had been, what that thing had done, and from that information, what that thing was. It was a trail of footprints, a resume. But first, you had to be sure your instruments were calibrated. Then you had to be sure you were seeing the proper thing. Then you had to transcribe the details. Then you had to decode them. Lastly, you had to have faith that this gave you the answers and contained no misleading or outright false information. It was a flawed process, to say the least. Victor didn't care about EC-001. He worried too much about the world at large, and EC-001 was just one of the many facets of its horrible new side. Oslia did happen to be interested in EC-001. It was the side of the new world closest to her life. Sometimes while typing her results, Oslia would feel as if someone was looking over her shoulder. She would turn and see that this was often true, as she worked with others, and the more curious were prone to casual glimpses at adjacent monitors. But this confirmation would bring her no relief. She would continue to feel like someone was looking over her shoulder, no matter where she turned. The nebulous thing would turn with her and see what she saw. Sometimes she would look at the video feed of EC-001 in the upper left display, and the thing would look with her. Brian, she would think. She wouldn't know where the name came from, but she believed it was a fitting name somehow. Short and simple, like the object she observed. Sometimes she would think Brian knew the names of everyone in the complex. She theorized it saw everything they did and the nuances of their work and home lives. Other times she thought it was just EC-001, the odd spiky circle. The odd spiky circle didn't think about her. It already knew.